says recording. So this is my story about how I came to the American Solidarity Party. So I grew up a secular kid, and then in the 1970s when Roe v. Wade was decided, I was convinced that that was an inappropriate decision based on my biological convictions. Biologically, I felt like life begins at conception. It was the only biological point I could point to that said this is now a different individual than the two parents that contributed the gametes to form this embryo, and therefore this is a new entity. So that was my original political convictions on the topic that I was originally motivated to care about politics on. That eventually led to my becoming more interested in other political topics. And when I was in college, I came to faith and now had a whole different set of concerns besides my scientific concerns about how to be good to people. Prior to that, I wasn't really concerned about how to be good to people. I was concerned about my science and my personal interests in getting ahead. But that changed when I came to faith. And subsequent to that, I decided to go to medical school rather than graduate school and became a physician and went down the medical path. In 1986, my wife and I went to the rainforest of what then was Zaire, now the Congo, and I worked in a hospital in the middle of the rainforest as the pediatrician in this 200-bed hospital. And during my 6 months there, really got to see a community that put the interests of the community ahead of the interests of the individual. And I mean that in a positive and celebratory way, not in a negative way. They didn't devalue individuals. They just really valued the community such that they would prioritize healthcare expenses that benefited the most people as opposed to optimizing outcomes for one person, which is, of course, very different than the way we do it in this country. So all those things led to a desire on my part to get involved in research on more global health issues and treating populations of people instead of an individual person. So that whole story led me to join the biotechnology industry. We moved to California in 1993, and I spent 20 years working in biotech before we moved back to Nebraska. And during that time, I was very involved in Republican politics as the primary pro-life party. Even in those days, there was not this real polarization that we have today, but even in those days, the Republican Party tended to be more pro-life than the Democrats tended to be. And my participation as a member of industry kind of aligned more with the economic policies of the Republicans compared to the Democrats. What sort of started to change my perspective about economic issues and social justice issues was, first of all, being in the Bay Area for a long time. Bay Area companies have a very different way of operating than most companies in this area have. For one thing, it's very unusual to be a Bay Area company and not have 20% of your stock owned by employees. And at least my experience here with most of the friends that I know who run companies here is that's not typically the way things are done here. Now, amongst tech companies, it's now become the same policy here as those sort of cultural corporate values have moved to the Midwest. But for most companies, that it's employees don't own 20%. So realizing how to align and include labor in the success of the company was one of the early awakening moments for me. Second one was during our last about 2 years that we lived in the Bay. I worked in a company in Berkeley, and we lived about a mile away in a town called Emeryville, which was right on the corner with Oakland. And we were about half a mile from kind of the biggest drug dealing corner in Oakland. And it just was a different socioeconomic environment that I ever lived in. I mean, I was a suburban, commuter guy. So living in an urban setting, really, really close to a very high crime area and walking back and forth to work every day, I got to know people along that walk who had life experiences very different than my own. And I sort of came to this realization that much of the petty crime that middle-class white people like myself get so upset about is really crimes of desperation and a consequence of misplaced values and priorities that really, really leave some people behind, and so that they're actually forced to do things that we would never consider doing, not because they're fundamentally bad people, but because they just have a bunch of really crappy choices available to them, and it's the best of the bad choices that they have. So it really resulted in this transition for me from being this very judgmental, hard, old white guy to understanding that, we have to find ways to work together. And these people who I think are so bad are in fact just like me. They just had a different set of life experiences that resulted in them being in a different place than me and having to make different choices than I have to make. So it's not so much that I'm so good as that I was born into a life that they weren't born into. And so as a result, I can make different choices. That whole understanding and really an appreciation of what would be the Christian religious concept of grace, that my life is by grace, not because I'm this awesome person, is really what eventually led to my finding the American Solidarity Party. A really important author, philosopher, politician who I found in my experience was this guy from the Netherlands named Abraham Kuyper, who was a philosopher and eventually became the prime minister of the Netherlands in the late 1800s. And he developed a party in the Netherlands called the Anti-Revolutionary Party that eventually included other Christian groups, and really most would say is the seed of what's now the Christian democratic movement in Europe, although eventually the leadership of that tilted south and was heavily influenced by Catholic thinkers later in the 19th century and most of the 20th century. But I was very attracted to Kuyper, and that reading kind of led me to stumble onto this group in the US called the American Solidarity Party, and seeing this platform that was deeply pro-life, but expanded that beyond these simplistic ideas that sometimes float around there, that being pro-life means you're concerned until a baby's born and then you're no longer concerned about justice for that individual anymore, really was attractive to me and created this idea that actually there's a home here. There's a home for pro-life, social justice, economic justice oriented people. That I felt like I didn't have before. I certainly wasn't happy in the modern Republican Party, but I also didn't feel at home in the Democratic Party. Although I have many Democratic friends here in town who are pro-life and are Democrats, and I think in Nebraska we are fortunate that issue isn't as polarized in our state as it is in many other states. But nonetheless, that's kind of my story and my journey. I'm sorry it took a longer time than I planned, but I was a pro-life Republican who took a long time to come to the Social and Economic Justice Party, but I'm here now.